Greetings to everyone who has joined our conference today. My name is Rob Entz. I'm the Executive Director of the Bateman Horn Center, and we're very grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you today in the midst of some uncertain and challenging times. We're also appreciative of the fact that we have the technology to be able to reach so many people. We're hopeful that all those who have wanted to participate in hearing this conversation today will be able to get on. We've had close to 500 registrants, and as a result of that, we will not be able to field live questions. A lot of questions came in during the preceding days and have been combined, and the providers as well as our research expert will also comment on some of the things so that we hope to address the issues that are most important to you. We recognize that we all are in uncertain and uneasy times. We know that this is exacerbated by the challenges that each of you endure with your illnesses. We recognize that. We want you to know of our unwavering commitment to be available to you as much as possible, to provide support, and most importantly, to provide information that you will find useful as you continue to manage these illnesses in your daily lives, in addition to pointing you to reliable resources to give you information about COVID-19 and the entire experience we are having around the country around the coronavirus. Want to also thank Talia Dostal. Many of you have bumped into her name recently because she's our new education director. She has put this together. And also Angela Linford, who is our communications director, to make sure that all of you are in touch with the opportunities we could provide. With that, I just want to say we'll dive into this conversation. And I'm going to introduce initially Dr. Suzanne Vernon, who is our research director, to head off the conversation. Before we do, just here are a couple of housekeeping items you'll see on the agenda. After we hear from Suzanne, we're going to have our medical providers, Dr. Bateman, Dr. Yellman, talk. And then after they're through, at the end, Talia will wrap up with a few logistics, reminding you that we are recording the session and where it will be available, as well as other materials that will be sent out in the near future. And then perhaps a quick wrap up and a close. This will last about 50 minutes, 50 to 55 minutes. And again, we so deeply appreciate your time and attention today, and we look forward to delivering this message to you. Suzanne.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to take the next 10 minutes or so to talk to you about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. Just a little bit of background on what this virus is. It's a coronavirus. There are several coronaviruses. The first one was actually isolated from the nose human back in 1965. And it was shown to be very similar to a virus that was circulating in chickens, causing chicken bronchitis. It is a very large enveloped positive strand or plus strand RNA virus. The RNA in the virus particle is about 30 kilobases long, single-stranded, 30 kilobases long. Coronaviruses cause highly prevalent disease in humans. We know there are several different types of coronaviruses that cause the common cold. Many of you are now aware that coronavirus was also the cause of SARS in 2003. And SARS stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome. And now we have SARS-CoV-2, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 for this 2019 virus that has emerged. MERS, which is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which happened back in, I can't remember exactly when, about 4 years ago. That's also a coronavirus. And now we have COVID-19, which stands for Coronavirus Disease 19 or 2019. Again, these are very highly prevalent viruses. There's coronaviruses in domestic animals, pigs, dogs, chickens, rabbits, mouse, etc. The MERS virus actually came from camels. These viruses in general occur during the wintertime because they prefer cool, dry conditions, which is what we're experiencing in many parts of the world now that are having the large rates of coronavirus spread. This particular virus, SARS-CoV-2, probably is coming from animals, wild animals, and that's linked to potentially the wet market in Wuhan. This is what the virus particle looks like. We know that it has an external spike on the virus particle, and this binds to the ACE2 receptor. Now, it's probably going to turn out that this particular model is for the first SARS. We do have some evidence that SARS-CoV-2 also binds to the ACE2 receptor, and there may be other receptors that we find the virus is binding to. The ACE2 receptor is expressed in many parts of the body, on epithelial surfaces, throughout the cardiovascular system. And that's why this virus is pretty efficient at infecting, the nose and the respiratory tract. And it's spread, obviously, through droplets. This, again, you can just imagine how many virus particles are in a sneeze like this. We know now that the incubation period for SARS-CoV-2 is about 5 to 14 days. And this variation probably depends on the dose that an individual gets, and possibly due to some of the genetic variation that is occurring in the virus. We also know that the majority of the infections are subclinical. And this is true for most virus infections in general. That doesn't mean, however, that the virus isn't being shed. There is new data out from a non-human primate study that shows the virus can be shed from the nose and the throat in the absence of clinical signs. So again, it's really important to think about the social distancing and the stay shelter in place, because right now the amount of subclinical infection and shedding that might go on. We now know that SARS-CoV-2 is being shed in fecal matter. There's a couple of studies showing that the virus can be isolated in feces. And a nice study that came out yesterday or the day before is showing that the virus is efficiently killed or inactivated with alcohol-based hand rubs. A minimum of 30% or greater alcohol solution effectively nukes the virus. Most of the hand sanitizer solutions are 60% alcohol or isopropanol. So that's good news for being able to deal with this virus effectively at home or just self-care. The virus does remain live in the air. It can remain in the air up to and infectious up to 3 hours. It can stay on various surfaces like copper or metal for several hours, cardboard up to 24 hours, and 3 days or more on plastic and stainless steel. Now that's if it's not exposed to disinfectants, etc. So we know that we can efficiently clean surfaces and kill the virus so that it's not transmitted. This is a really nice interactive map on the CDC's website that you can do and click on the state that you're at. And when you click on that state, then county by county infection rate information will come up. It'll actually pull up your state health department data. This is a super nice bit of information that's updated daily. Most state health departments are updating daily at the end of the day with the most recent tests. So I recommend going to cdc.gov if you're interested in, what's going on in your state and checking this site out. We also know, because it is a coronavirus and because it is an RNA virus, they change quite quickly. There was also a lot of speculation that this virus was engineered by some evil mastermind somewhere. And actually a publication that just came out in Nature Medicine, and Ian Lipkin is involved in this research, or in this paper, showed that the virus has naturally evolved and was not constructed in the lab. This type of sequence information is very important for vaccine design and for design of antivirals, as well as just to really understand what is going on with the virus out in nature. I'm going to try to click on this before I go there. This actually shows, this graph down here actually shows, over here, shows the rate of change in the virus over time, the colors representing the types of mutations that are occurring in the virus over time. This just shows where the virus started. And then this purple color shows the initial sequence of the virus. And then as it spread to various parts of the world, the genetic changes are detected. It's a really pretty cool illustration of just how quickly this virus spread around the world, and also how it is continuing to evolve. You guys, can go to this nextstrain.org. I'll stop. Hopefully I can stop this and get on with my presentation here. So anyway, the virus is changing, and you can check out again how this virus is continuing to evolve over time. This is nextstrain.org, is a super cool site. I mean, labs from all over the world are depositing sequences to nextstrain.org to make this type of mapping possible. Real quick word about testing. Right now, RT-PCR is the approach that is being used to test for this virus. This is an RNA virus, so it needs to first be changed into DNA that can then be amplified exponentially in order to be able to detect it. The other aspects that are really important about testing is that we have to first take the nasal swab or the mouth swab or whatever kind of sample it is, and extract the virus RNA out of that sample. That is not a trivial issue. It's obviously being done, but this brings in important issues about sampling, the efficiency of sampling, how that sample is handled, and how that sample is extracted in order to be able to ultimately go into the end assay. So we're also now realizing the supply chain issues associated with testing. So testing, again, has been an issue in this country because of all of the parts that are involved in ultimately giving a result to the individual or the doctor. There are serology assays that are under development. I'm sure they're going to be rolling out pretty quickly. Serology is different than RT-PCR because serology detects antibodies that the body makes to the virus. So this can actually identify a current infection or a past exposure, depending on the types of antibodies that are being tested for. Now, getting tested. There's a lot of questions about getting tested. This is directly from the CDC website and the recommendations from the CDC. I imagine that once more tests become available, that testing will become more accessible and widespread. But in the meantime, testing is at a premium for a number of reasons, and I'm sure Dr. Bateman and Yeoman will get into that a little bit more. This is something that I just became aware of this morning. It's called the COVID-19 Symptom Tracker. You can download the app. It's called doc.ai, at doc.ai. And then once you download the app, you can go to the research tab, and the symptom tracker will be there. So this doc.ai has been a symptom tracker app for a while, and what they've done is they've just updated it now to include the symptoms for COVID-19. I haven't tried it, but it looks super cool, and I think it could be a way to help you and your doctor determine whether or not you have COVID-19. A lot of work going on, literally on practically a minute-by-minute basis on vaccines, antivirals, and treatment. There is the first vaccine trial started in Seattle a couple days ago. It's using some messenger RNA vaccine technology, which is very interesting. This is a relatively new technology that puts the RNA right into the cell so that the cell then expresses specific virus proteins rather than using a whole virus or a virus mixed with a bunch of different kinds of things. But vaccines are really intended to try to boost your immune system so that the body can recognize the infection and neutralize it. And there are obviously a lot of other vaccine approaches that are underway. There's also been some studies about passive immunization, and this is an approach that provides people with antibodies derived from people that have recovered or convalesced from infection. And there is a preprint that was put out a couple days ago showing that monkeys develop antibodies and then are resistant to reinfection once, and that these antibodies actually neutralize the virus. So this is also good news for developing immunity, as well as this convalescent serum approach, passive immunity approach. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the hydroxychloroquine trial that happened in France. A little bit about that. This virus, as you can see in this picture here, attaches to a cell and then is endocytosed. It's brought into the cell cytoplasm. What that endocytosis depends on is a drop in pH so that the virus can then dump its contents into the cytoplasm. Chloroquine raises the pH of the endosome bubble inside the cell, and that prevents the virus from blocking or from entering into the cell. So it blocks infection. And the hydroxychloroquine is the less toxic form of chloroquine, and that is what's currently being tested in humans. Research is also underway to develop other antiviral drugs that block these various steps that the virus uses when it infects a cell. So the bright side of the COVID-19 pandemic is that this is unprecedented amount of global information and data sharing. It's just crazy. I mean, the amount of data and information that's coming out practically in real time is just fabulous. So check out nextstrain.org if you're interested in the virus. Here's bioarchives and medarchives.org. These are both preprint servers hosted by Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory that provide preprints. And specifically, they have a specific spot for all of the SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 information. Clinical trial networks are popping up as we speak because of the hospitals now trying various types of treatments on their patients, again, all over the world. There are registries that are beginning to track recovery of people that succumbed to COVID-19 or that had COVID-19. This is going to be super important for understanding the chronic sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection and post-viral syndromes resulting from COVID-19. And finally, it's going to be a boon for virology. I'm hoping anyway. The new awareness for viruses and vaccines, antivirals, and repurposed drugs like hydroxychloroquine. And this will also hopefully translate into a big influx of research dollars around the world.
Dr. Yellman and I are going to go through a little bit of an outline and maybe talk back and forth about some of the issues. I know that we got many really specific questions, but there's a lot we don't know right now. So I'm going to try to stick to the things that we know, be very practical, and take that kind of approach. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here. So one of the things I wanted to start with is that there's a lot of names floating around for this virus. So I listed several of the things up there, and there's some fine distinctions, but for general purposes, they all apply to either the virus itself or the viral illness that the virus causes. So you might want to just be a little loose and familiar with those terms. Like Suzanne, I want to talk about some of the upside of this, only I'm going to start with it instead of end with it, but reinforce that there's some really, maybe some positive things for our population, our chronically ill population. And people with ME/CFS already, you know how to shelter in place, you know how to entertain yourself at home, you know how to be careful in crowds and avoid contact with sick people. It's the rest of the population that's having a major problem adjusting to this. And we're going to have to train them so that you're not as much at risk. I also want to say there are some important things that people with ME/CFS might benefit from. And this is a little bit of repetition from Suzanne, but it doesn't hurt to hear it more than once. And that is, number one, the treatment, and Suzanne didn't really mention this, but the actual treatment regimens for this new virus might be regimens that would help ME/CFS. I mean, our patient populations are a post-infectious population, post-viral. And some of the medicines that are being looked at have actually been used by Dr. Chia, by Dr. Montoya, and some other people in prescribing off-label for ME/CFS itself. So that's really exciting because that might open up the doors and teach us something about our illness as we experience the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to say that I'm excited about improved access to telemedicine and insurance reimbursement for telemedicine, because that's going to benefit people who are homebound or who are too sick to leave their homes, or who need to reach doctors across state lines. I want to say that there's going to be a little revolution with businesses in understanding the benefit of working from home. And this is going to open up job possibilities for people who are moderately ill and mildly ill with ME/CFS. A lot of my patients are able to maintain employment if they're able to work one day from home, for example. And I have other people who've maintained working almost completely from home. So this is going to open some doors that I think will be very helpful. And then, as Suzanne mentioned, there are going to be great advancements in the science of viruses, testing for viruses, and tracking post-viral syndromes. And we're going to have access to new drugs for treating viral infections. We've had such a limited number of drugs that we could use, and they were very limited to HIV or some other areas of medicine, but I'm hoping this will open our eyes and give us access to more antiviral drugs. And hopefully in the long run, this is going to create an awareness of how important it is for us to all have access to good health care and public health services. There are a couple of issues I want to clarify for everybody because they can get very commingled. And that is, there are public health measures, and then there are personal safety and personal medical decisions. And they're not always the same thing. In fact, they really aren't the same thing, but there is some overlap. So public health measures are what you're hearing about on all the media and all the direction. So the whole idea of public health measures is to contain this virus. Early testing to track and study and implement measures to contain it. The responsibility to teach and convince the public how to behave to slow the spread. And honestly, this is applying mostly to people who are less vulnerable to the virus. Many large numbers of people who need to buy into this idea of social distancing, physical distancing, and not putting people at risk, to flatten that curve so that we stretch out the time as this virus unfolds, and so that the health systems are not overloaded. And this is all the things you're hearing on TV and on social media. And also our public health measures are to support our healthcare systems and try to keep them running and efficient. And I have to say, while it was a little bit of a slow start, I'm impressed and enthusiastic and optimistic that our country is blasting full bore ahead to try to meet the needs. So the other issue really is personal guidance and decision making. This is how does it affect you? And I want to say these are some bullet points that I put out. The first is that crisis is a great equalizer. And while there has been great discrimination against people with ME/CFS and fibro, that's going to disappear, and everybody's going to be treated the same. And that's going to be good for us. In light of that fear and a little bit about that knowledge gap about ME/CFS, we have prepared a 2-page handout, and I'm going to ask Talia to put this handout out, and we'll show you and we'll make it available to you. First page, I've tried to make the handout pretty straightforward, and so you don't need to read the handout right now, but this is a 2-page handout. On the first page, there's a couple of paragraphs of general introduction, and then there are some quick tips for managing patients who become acutely ill. And this is just information to doctors about giving IV fluids, reducing loud noises and bright light, and being patient with cognitive impairment, and a little bit of advice about medications. On the back of the form is more of the scientific evidence supporting those decisions. So the back of the form is more what doctors are used to listening to. And the front of the form is, hey, you better do this and do it right away, without a lot of explanation. So and I'm hoping that this kind of a form will be really helpful for people who need to, if you get sick and you need to interface at the emergency room, or you get admitted to the hospital. And for right now, it's specific for COVID-19, but honestly, these are this is general advice for people with ME/CFS. And Talia, if you go down to the bottom, I'll just go down to the bottom of the page. I'll just show them so most of page 2 came from a single article by Dr. Tony Komaroff. That is a peer-reviewed, evidence-based article, and you can see that reference. So we're going to make this handout available. So, you need to follow the recommendations that are being made. Shelter at home, limit your exposure to others. You're probably at less risk for getting this than everyone else. Your home is a safe place, and you just need to do some basic things. It's important for you to know that testing is still limited. It's ramping up. And 2 days ago, I would have said there's really no need to get tested unless you end up having to go to the hospital. But I'm feeling a little more hopeful now, because a positive test will lead to medical advice and prioritization of care based on illness severity. But now we actually have some drugs that can be used, and they're going to have to be prioritized for the most sick patients because there's such a huge demand. So just remember that the test itself isn't going to help you, and that really you don't need to seek medical care unless your symptoms worsen to the point that hospital admission is required for fluids, oxygen, treatment of complications, and possibly intensive care unit admission with likelihood, if you go to the ICU, you'll probably get intubated and put on a ventilator. And people that have the most severe illness are saved, or they are taken through the most severe parts of illness by assisting them in oxygen and ventilation. In emergency situations, and this, I want to emphasize this, people with ME/CFS, you should engage in the highest quality medical interventions for that emergency condition. It takes priority over ME/CFS at the point you become that sick. If you get sick, you don't need to give advice about management of COVID-19 to your doctors. They're going to be many steps ahead of you, and you just need to trust that they'll know what to do and do the best you can to help them understand the nature of your illness. And I'm hoping that handout will help. So drug treatment is very rapidly becoming more available. And interestingly, as I said, these treatments may actually help improve ME/CFS in the long run. So I'm very optimistic. Now I want to say a word about advanced directives. Everyone, not just those with ME/CFS and not just people sick with COVID-19, should document your end-of-life wishes on paper, and you should say specifically what you want in terms of aggressive care and in a life-threatening situation. You should discuss it with your family and caregivers. And this is important. This is important for any chronic illness. Every situation is individual, and it's important in a time like this that everybody know what they want to do if a severe illness overtakes you. And this is important in situations even besides COVID-19. Dr. Yeldman, do you want to, haven't really left you time for comments, and anything you want to say about any of these comments?
Well, to your most recent comment about advanced directives, what we're really talking about here is in an ICU situation. If you were to become particularly ill and not be able to communicate your wishes at that time for yourself. And so if you want your specific wishes carried out, making those known to your family and friends, making those written down legally can help physicians and your family members to carry through with your wishes. So things that come up, for example, in an ICU situation would be, do you even want to be intubated? And if you are intubated, how long do you stay intubated and sedated and paralyzed before we say, well, what are we doing here? So those things can come up, especially in a pandemic like this, and the people who are getting most ill from COVID-19 are ending up on respirators and intubated. So making those wishes known to your family helps take a huge burden off of them were the worst to happen. And so kind of planning for the worst and hoping for the best is sort of the idea behind this. I also wanted to comment, Dr. Bateman, on you touching on testing specifically. And this is really rapidly evolving, but I think, as you mentioned, as recent as Wednesday, my thought process goes back to what you initially brought up at the beginning of your talk, which is there are public health measures, and then there are measures that are there specifically for those who are sick as individuals. And really, for a long time now, testing has been more for an epidemiological perspective to say how many people have this illness and what can we do about it and where is it and how can we track it? How is that going to help us as a country take care of this pandemic? And one could argue that if you as an individual with ME/CFS were to develop a fever and a cough, some of the most prominent symptoms of this illness, certainly you would feel terrible. Certainly you could have a crash of post-exertional malaise or a flare of fibromyalgia with this illness. But that is different than being in respiratory distress, not being able to breathe. And at first, or at least as of recent, the supportive treatment available for coronavirus was to provide respiratory support, from things like oxygen all the way up to ventilators. And were those not needed, were you to specifically have symptoms of a bad viral infection that feels awful, but is not impairing your ability to breathe, one could argue that maybe going out into the public and getting exposed to others who might have the illness and getting tested may not be the best thing to do, specifically when you have a limited energy envelope that you need to fight that infection, whatever it is that you have, whether it be COVID-19 or something else. Now, that is changing, right? So as we start to be able to offer more treatments or preventative therapies, and as we start getting more data internationally, as Dr. Vernon was pointing out earlier, that the reasons for getting tested may change. But as of right now, with the limited testing that's available, unless you are really sick in the first place, as of today, I know the state of Utah probably won't be testing you. So it's something to keep an eye on, and that is a really moving target as to whether or not you really should get tested and how that's going to affect you specifically as an individual.
Right. And so until we have availability of effective medications for anyone at any stage of disease, there's going to be a lot of prioritization, and that the testing and the treatment are going to go to people who are symptomatic and more severely ill. So just be patient, and it's an evolving situation. Thanks, Dr. Yeoman. That was very articulate.
I would also want to point out one other thing that I think is always important for those who are ill, but also for healthcare providers, and that is not to get stuck in a one-track mind about what you think is going on with you, right? If you were to get a fever and muscle aches and be very sick, or even have respiratory distress, it's important to remember that COVID-19 is not the only thing that causes this. Influenza is still going around, and that is also a dangerous virus. We just know a lot more about it and have been studying it for a lot longer.
Yeah, I have a little.
But people should be testing you for influenza.
Yep, I have a little reference about that, but I won't skip down until we get there. So we don't need to spend too long on this page, but you should stay up to date by listening to the most trusted sources. You can trust them right now. They're in full gear. They are intent. They are working together, and they are going to be the most likely place. And not only these sites that I've listed, but it's really interesting to track on the World Health Organization site. Just put WHO INT, period INT, and the CDC is working hard, and then there's some good information on the NIH. And I think most of the major networks are doing a pretty good job of trying to be responsible in their reporting. But just be careful about what you listen to, especially on social media. Just be careful, and don't, your emotions are part of stress, and you need to have calmness and not, as Dr. Yeoman says, going off on tangents or isolating your thinking. Just look for good sources of information. Some general information that maybe is old news. There are many, many drug candidates, not just chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. The FDA is committed to fast-tracking drug approvals and being flexible. And the other thing I want you to know that's really important, doctors at the front lines and in the ICU can prescribe drugs off-label. They do not have to rely on FDA-approved drugs. And they can sometimes apply for compassionate use of drugs that are still in clinical trials or experimental. And I've read about at least 14 possible drugs that are being investigated and developed and in clinical trials. So I think that things are going to move quickly along those lines. Also, I did some research on vaccines, and there are at least 20 different companies and institutions working furiously on vaccines. And there's a competition going on, which is great. So things are going to happen quickly when money is invested and people work together. As Suzanne said, networking across the world, sharing data. So those are all reasons for optimism. You know, these things get out of date quickly, but I watched a YouTube video on 2 days ago that was broadcast by the editor-in-chief of JAMA, that's the Journal of the American Medical Association, with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is one of our leading voices and experts on infections and viruses. And you should seek him out. He's one of the most knowledgeable, direct, honest, and sensible people that is speaking to us. So I would encourage you to do that if you want to look that up. You can, I'm sure you can find that if you do. It's called Coronavirus Update with Anthony Fauci. And I'm sure you can find that probably on YouTube. And there are many, many others. So we picked a few questions that came in to us. I think you probably know the answers to a lot of these. The first is, are people with ME/CFS and FM high risk of serious disease with COVID-19? And I would say, honestly, we don't know for sure, but I think we should assume yes. But remember that there are risk factors for everybody, including the older you are, if you have underlying heart and lung disease, diabetes, or immunocompromised in some way. And we think that the immune dysregulation of ME/CFS may reduce the ability to fight viral infections, especially early on in illness. And then we also have people with chronic inflammation and allergies, asthma, mast cell activation, and that may pose additional risks. So I think it's probably safe to say that if you do get coronavirus, you might fall into a higher risk category. So those are other reasons to seek expert care. Another question we got was, should we be taking any measures different than the general population? And I would say probably not, actually. We just need to be aware. Everyone, ME/CFS patients and everyone else, should take these federal and state guidelines very seriously and implement them. I'm really proud of our governors. I think that the states are really taking action and providing good guidance. And I can only speak for the ones that I've heard about, but that's true here. What you need to do is remember to implement these measures in the home with your family, because anybody who goes out and then comes back in needs to follow those rules of hand washing, social distancing, don't share towels, clean shared surfaces often. And if you go out into the community, slip off your shoes at the door, and when you come back, and go immediately and wash your hands, and keep your house that safe place, right, against contamination from outside germs.
Dr. Bateman, could you comment on what cleaning solutions or methods you would use for cleaning your house?
You know,
Dr.
we have a
Yeoman?
really good video that Linda Milne did that's on our website and our YouTube channel. She addresses in great detail some of those cleaning supplies that you can use and how to make homemade ones, to include kind of like making your own Lysol or Clorox wipes. So I suggest you check that out. We will include that in our recap.
I know that Suzanne mentioned earlier the solutions that had at least 30% alcohol, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Suzanne, if you could validate that.
Those are hand washing solutions.
Just the hand washing.
But yeah, as far as cleaning products that come into the home, cleaning your shoes, etc., the videos by Linda Milne would be a great resource there.
So a little bit of advice about outside assistance. Those of you who rely on deliveries and people come in to help you, just have to do the best you can. Minimize the number of visitors by prioritizing. Some things can be left at the front door. If people come in, have them wash their hands immediately before they do anything, and then clean off surfaces they've touched before they leave the house. And you know, the packaging can be removed, disposed, or washed, and then wash your hands before you touch the things that are inside that packaging. So remember, it's not, you don't get sick from having it on your hands. You get sick from transferring from your hands to your face. And This question came up is how am I going to know the difference between my ME/CFS symptoms and COVID-19? And I would just say you will. You know your body, listen to it. I would encourage people to get tested for influenza if you suspect it, or work with your doctor to have Tamiflu on hand. And I just wanted to mention this. There was a study in Italy at the beginning when there were hundreds of cases, and they prepared a testing kit for respiratory viruses, all the common respiratory viruses. And only about 50% of people had a positive test for one of these common viruses or bacterial. And of those people who tested positive, 28% were some type of influenza, and only 2% tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 in that testing, and all the people who presented for medical attention. So even in a place in early, at least in the early stages in Italy, when they were not too early. So remember that if you get sick, it's still not the likelihood that it's going to be SARS. And the other illness that can do damage is the flu. Now, I think in the interest of time that we should probably close. And I want to say that this is a rapidly changing and evolving situation, which is, it's kind of scary to know that the virus is spreading, but it's also inspirational to see that the medical and scientific community and our population are rising up to work together. And it might, I think we'll rapidly see more access to testing and treatment. So stay informed, think clearly, and be prepared. And I'm going to quote Dr. Fauci, who said, "Channel panic toward the resolve to do something about it." Dr. Yeoman, do you want to add anything?
I had a couple points to touch on really quickly. The first, there were a lot of questions about anti-inflammatory medications and whether those should be used or not. If you feel like you're ill with COVID, or if you're worried about exposures. A lot of the things that we use for fibromyalgia and ME/CFS, such as low-dose naltrexone, are not anti-inflammatory in the same mechanism as the ones that have been in the news. So the ones that have been implicated as potentially not being the best of ideas are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs, NSAIDs, and that includes things like ibuprofen and naproxen. They're not a death knell by any means, but those are the specific mechanisms of action that have been identified as potentially not the best idea at this time and place. Low-dose naltrexone works from a completely different perspective, as do many of the therapies that we have offered our ME/CFS and fibromyalgia patients. Secondly, I would say, remember overall that you still experience life through the lens of your ME/CFS or through your fibromyalgia. And that is present every day. And if you want to stay informed, you want to be up to date on what's going on in the world, both from an infectious perspective and what effect this is having on the economy perspective. But don't spend your time getting obsessed with things either, because using the entirety of your energy envelope for fear, for anxiety, is not going to help your illness. It's going to make you more susceptible, not less. Being at home, being hunkered down is the most control you can have. I was even thinking about myself today, and in this video, I've probably touched my face 15 times. Don't get on yourself if you mess up. If you touch something that you think is an infected surface that doesn't guarantee infection, just try to minimize the risk. That's all we have control over. And to worry about or obsess about anything more than that is probably going to lead to you doing worse than better. So keep that in mind. Remember to take care of yourself in the ways that you always have.
Dr. Yeoman, Dr. Bateman, and Dr. Vernon, thank you so much for your time today and your insights. Rob, do you have anything else you want to say?
I do, thank you, and I'll be very, very brief. First of all, I want to just reiterate how important it is to get information from reliable sources. Cindy talked briefly about, Dr. Bateman, pardon me, talked about the CDC, NIH, and the World Health Organization. I also think it's really important that wherever you live, that you listen very carefully and follow the guidance of your state health departments. Those are the individuals who are coordinating all of the activities of the medical care facilities in your state. And their guidance may vary a little bit from state to state. although we are starting to synchronize a little better across the country expectations. But it's really important that you look and rely upon your state health department. The other thing, it was mentioned very briefly about advanced directives. And a lot of people that get confused about the difference between an advanced directive and a provider or a physician or medical order of life-sustaining treatment. It depends on the state, generally what they call it. And a POLST or a MOLST is generally most used when a person has end of life imminent decisions to make and has to be signed by a medical provider. An advanced directive can be signed by you, the individual, with a witness or two, depending on states. It may or may not be acknowledged by another state if you're traveling. But I'm going to just give you one quick reference on a share screen. And this is just happens to be the state of Utah, but it might give you some guidance. Most state health departments will have information on this. But if you go to the Utah Commission on Aging site, and anybody can look at this across the country, ucoa.utah.edu, and you can get information about the POLST agreement here is specific to Utah, but again, your state health department would have it. But the advanced directive, which gives the guidance like a medical power of attorney, as well as some living will elements. There's a toolkit, which is really useful about things you should be asking yourself to make the decisions of how you fill out your form. And then there's an English and a Spanish version. Now, I give you this because there are plenty of resources out there to do that, but this is one you could go to for a little bit of guidance. And maybe, Ty, one of the documents we can include with the others is the difference between these two documents and where they are most applicable and when they're to be used. It's a very simple side-by-side that can supplement all of the things that are being sent to you folks. So we'll wrap this up. Again, thank you so much for your time and attention today. We hope this has been meaningful, and we may find ourselves doing this periodically because we are on a journey here that we don't know exactly where it's all going to end up, and I think having a constant conversation is useful. So with that, thank you all. Have a great day, and we wish you the very best. Thank you from the Bateman Horne Center.